Thank you for joining. My name is Kathy Feltz. I'm the Senior Vice President of Customer Success here at Q-Centrix. So thank you for joining us today for this webinar, Revolutionizing Clinical Data Management for a New Healthcare Era. I'm going to go ahead and start with some housekeeping rules, very general, but all of you have been muted just to maintain the integrity of this webinar. But we certainly encourage questions. We're going to talk about some topics that certainly are really important topics for us. So if you have any questions, place them in the Q&A box in the bottom of your screen. We'll collect those and try to answer as many as we can at the end of the webinar. We're recording this webinar, and we're also going to reference a few assets that we'll share with you after the webinar, and we encourage you to share with your colleagues as well. And last but certainly not least, please fill out the post-webinar survey. We gain topics that we share with you from your feedback as a participant, and we're always eager to learn what is the most valuable content for you. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists. So first and foremost, Raghu Bukkapatnam is our Chief Growth Officer. He oversees all of the commercial efforts at Q-Centrix with an interest in the evolving healthcare market and specifically the dynamics impacting clinical data management. Next, we have Mitch Bragg, who is our legal counsel as well as the VP of Commercial Operations. And Mitch's area of expertise is really around the legal effects of data usage as well as privacy and security standards and strategy. So he'll talk about that. Next, we have Victor Wang, our Senior Vice President of Research and Data. Victor owns our research strategy, and so he aligns data, data infrastructure, and our capabilities to deliver high quality research data sets. Last but certainly not least, we have Chris Hansen. He is the head of our data engineering here, and he manages the architecture as well as the maintenance of our data infrastructure. He comes with a wealth of knowledge in delivering data solutions within healthcare. So welcome to our guests, our panelists, my esteemed colleagues, and I'm going to go ahead and get started. First and foremost, I do want to mention we're talking about clinical data today, and there's just a ton of data out there. So just defining what we are referring to when we talk about clinical data, that's any data that is generated within the healthcare setting by a patient encounter. We're not going to be talking about wearables today. We're talking about clinical data in that respect. And 2022 was a tipping point for healthcare leaders as it relates to their utilization of clinical data, just really reassessing how they're utilizing it, as well as the return that they're bringing to their organization. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We certainly talk about that in our 2022 State of the Industry report, which is on the screen now. Within this report, we touch on research as well as health equity. We will absolutely be touching on some of that today. We also talk about efficiencies that will be gained through clinical data usage, and we'll talk about that as well. We're going to share the State of the Industry report with you after this webinar. But before all of that, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to start with Raghu and ask him if he could just share with everyone here his impressions of the clinical data market today and the landscape. Raghu?
Great, thanks, Kathy, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. I do think it's important to level set where we are with clinical data as an industry, and in particular regarding the high impact data that, as Kathy mentioned, is generated at hospitals and health systems across the country. And what we've seen time in, time out is hospitals are right now spending a tremendous amount of time, money, and resources creating this, what I would argue is an incredibly valuable asset, clinical data, often from unstructured data. Now, let me just contextualize this a little bit, right? What we have generally seen is a typical 8-hospital, let's call it $2 billion or so in net patient revenue. So a fairly good-sized health system might be spending upwards of $10 million to generate this data. There has been an exponential increase in clinical data being generated, and considering the financial challenges that the industry is facing today, this investment, we would argue, is even that much more substantial. Interestingly enough, though, when we partner with facilities to perform an enterprise assessment on their clinical data management, and what we see again and again is that hospitals often don't know how much they are spending. And more importantly, we'd argue, they can't articulate or quantify the value that they are getting from that investment. And the conclusion that we typically come to when we do interviews with physicians and with administrators and with the chief clinical officers, medical officers, CEOs, is how that data is captured and managed is preventing that value capture. It's preventing, I would argue, full value capture. And that's because typically when you look at clinical data management, it occurs at a service line level, right? So think cardiology, oncology, the surgical service lines, et cetera, et cetera. And oftentimes we see it even more narrow than that, right? At the individual registry, or perhaps even at an individual physician level, depending on who that physician might be. And so we do miss out on the full value of this data. And if you could just open the aperture of that clinical data, make it wider, really thinking about it from an enterprise level, we would argue it frees up that data. Some would call this democratizing that data. And certainly we see this regarding performance improvement, right? To be able to leverage the data at the enterprise level, we would argue is critical for improving quality in healthcare.
Yeah, it's a really great point about the data silos that exist within these hospitals. From my vantage point, I think we're starting to see some of these early indicators that at various hospitals, people are starting to take this type of enterprise thinking and strategy a bit more seriously to sort of unlock this data that hospitals, spend a lot of time and money in at the departmental level creating. And so we have some hospital partners that have started leveraging, registry data generated from their quality department to help manage their hiring decisions, right? Understanding patient flows from surgery to medical oncology to radiation oncologist, mapping out the types of services that patients are having at these facilities actually help them determine, okay, do we need a specialized surgeon to come in because our community actually needs it? Ultimately, this type of data can really help drive more targeted thinking and decision making down to hiring decisions and the investments that a hospital might make. Similarly, I think what we're starting to do is see this a lot more on the research front. So research departments are trying to leverage historical clinical data that's been, cleaned and abstracted for maybe other purposes to help them align on what better clinical trials that they can bring in that'll help them succeed in that clinical trial. But most importantly, to bring in the right clinical trials for the patient population in their catchment area. That said, of course, this is few and far between, right? We're very much in the early days of this type of thinking and this type of strategy at our hospitals. And we see quite a number of challenges with it. One of the largest ones is probably really the change management. When data is siloed, it's oftentimes that there's not a shared understanding of what data is available and how to best use it, or what departments manage different functions that touch on that data. So false starts in these efforts can actually wind up having a pretty negative impact on the decision making and sort of trust in the data overall. And then, outside of change management, I'd say that the other major barrier that we encounter is that hospitals have a lot of concerns around the privacy and security and just the management of all of this data, because on the whole, most people agree with the desire to be more data driven. But there are a lot of these sort of small steps that need to happen in order to sort of promote this type of transparency in a secure way.
Victor, I totally agree. It's a great point about the need for privacy. I thought it'd be useful to take a minute too to explain some of the common ways that data can be stored within a data warehouse. So there's two common terms that you'll probably hear pretty often, and you'll hear on this webinar as well, of the data warehouse and the data lake. And the quick 30,000-foot view of these is a data warehouse, like its namesake of a traditional warehouse or a Costco warehouse, is a tight organizational structure for the data. Just like in a warehouse, every item has a specific shelf that it goes on. Every item has a, not just a shelf, but a slot on the shelf where it goes on, so that when you need to get it later, you can go find it. And that's how a data warehouse is built as well. It's tables are created with columns clearly defined so that when report writers and analysts want to find that data later, it's easy to find. They know exactly where it is. Whereas a data lake, another term that's really common in the industry, is a little bit different. A data lake is a place where data can be loaded in very, very quickly. I mean, you can almost think of it as like throwing something into the lake. It's very, very easy to do, but that might be a little bit harder to get it out again later. Data lake requires a lot of specialized tools and skills to be able to use effectively for analytics or data science. But it has the benefit of being able to load everything in healthcare, from images and fire data. It can basically store any type of data, but it is a little bit harder to use. But regardless of which of these we use, whether it's the data warehouse or the data lake, that security is paramount of importance. Every organization, every healthcare organization, when we're dealing with patient data and healthcare data, of course, we have to follow HIPAA rules, SOC 2 compliance, and other rules that protect that data. There's variations between states, local privacy laws, and federal laws. But regardless, the goal here is to protect patient data. We want to make it accessible and usable for analytics and improving care. But we also need to make sure that it's secure, whether that's in a data warehouse or a data lake or transferring in between the two. There's a lot of rules that we need to put in place and follow to keep that data secure. And I think this is really top of mind for a lot of healthcare organizations right now because of some of the recent headlines around things like data breaches and patient data leaking out in various breaches. And that's why it's a huge priority for all of us.
Yeah, Chris, I totally agree because, it's come so far in the last decade to see that data security and compliance with the different state and national laws is now a board level conversation. And if it's not, it hopefully will be at every health system and frankly, every vendor in the space right now, because it takes a tremendous amount of resources, not just financial resources, but obviously time. There's a myriad of different folks that could be hired to oversee a data security program. And that's in addition to understanding the technical things like you were describing, the data warehouse and data lake. So, when there is a breach, or if there's a breach, hopefully nobody ever experiences it, but we all know in this day and age, it's nearly impossible to avoid, even if you take all the precautions that are out there. The financial implications are real. It's not just the penalties and the fines and the call center costs. It's frankly also the mark that a health system or a provider or a vendor can receive as a result of a data breach. So this is why a lot of organizations, Q-Centrix included, seek to obtain certifications. What you mentioned, SOC 2. There's high trust. There's this middle ground that fits in between of a SOC 2 and a high trust. So for those that aren't as familiar with what those mean, we're all familiar. Hopefully, if we're on this call and we're in the healthcare space, we know what HIPAA is, and we know that it was originally set up as a means more of sharing data across multiple providers. But as the law has evolved, these frameworks have been set up, and that's really what SOC 2 and high trust are. They're frameworks. They're a ruler, if you will, to measure performance against. To take it out of the lawyer in me, it's like your local building code officer saying your 2x4s have to be a certain thickness, a certain height, or your wall needs to be a certain thickness. The idea is that maybe it's a bit more nuanced than this, but organizations that handle sensitive patient data, they have to opt into SOC 2 and high trust certification. They have to spend the money. They have to hire an outside third party, an independent third party that can say your data lake, your data warehouse, your email system, all of these different, these different tools that you're using to shuttle PHI around are in compliance with HIPAA and in compliance with high trust and the different local privacy rules and regulations. And it's easy to get wound around the axle and say, kind of throw your hands up and say, what should I do when selecting a vendor? But the easiest thing to do is, to look for a vendor that has a SOC 2, a high trust certification, these types of generally accepted rules and rulers that they are measured against. I think that's where it's really important when you have disparate vendors, whether it's a housekeeping service or a clinical data organization like us, or even shredding companies. It's really important to make sure that you're conducting that assessment on the facility side, on the health system side, because without that, it can leave you in a little bit of uncertainty. So.
Mitch, you mentioned having the different vendors for housekeeping service or for a data service. And in most cases, I think, you've identified a couple that are very specialized. You wouldn't mix and match your laundry service and your supply service, for example. You usually are looking for vendors that are very specialized in one particular area and that can bring an expertise to the need that you're trying to fill. But we do think that one of the areas where it might not make as much sense to, mix and match vendors and specialize is in data centralization and data security. You don't want somebody, coming in and architecting the data or creating reports that isn't thinking about how that data is going to be secured. And you don't want somebody, coming in and securing data that already exists, following the SOC 2 and high trust standards. There's going to be too many opportunities for things to be missed. Data that was created that didn't end up on a diagram or something that could be missed in a security assessment. Having vendors that handle both of those cases, that are experts on data and experts on security, really is going to get the best of both worlds for making that data accessible and usable and be able to lead to outcome improvements and best practices for the hospital, but also keeping the patient data secured and protected. This includes everything from access control, and there's a lot of different ways that can be implemented. As hospitals are realizing, I need this department to be able to access this part of a patient's data, but this department shouldn't be able to access the other part of the patient data. Identifying exactly what the department needs or the team members need to be able to do their job. There's a lot of different options for access control, from everything from putting the data into containers or schema rules or row-level security. And so just getting the data available isn't enough anymore. Protecting the data and following the HIPAA guidelines and going the extra mile with SOC 2 and high trust really requires an organization that understands data, how to make it available and how to make it useful, and also how to protect it and secure it.
So I maybe want to take a step back. I think for our audience, right, the legal and the engineering frameworks can likely make some of this topic feel a bit, inaccessible. And so maybe a step back is to just identify what we mean by de-identification. Very simply, de-identifying data involves stripping PII. So this is things like patient names, social security numbers, and phone numbers, removing all of that from the output, as well as going through a process called professional statistical de-identification. And so this is typically done by outside shops that determine, aspects of your specific data, the data elements that you have, and make suggestions in terms of making the data set as a whole a very low probability of being able to re-identify any patient contained within that. I say this broadly to mean that, while there are a lot of component parts as it relates to getting certifications, as well as having various servers to store your information, this isn't a black box activity, right? There's a set of well-known rules to follow, and lots of services that can help with this type of thinking. And it becomes easier to do the more this data actually gets centralized, right? You're running one clean set of processes to store all of your data together. And so for the decision makers on the call, it's less around the in the weeds view of exactly what to do, but more knowing that there is a set of criteria, and it's not this ambiguous, sort of hard to define process. I think all of these conversations relevant to my role on the research side is that by having clear processes to de-identify data, to remove PII, to have a statistically de-identified data set, that allows hospitals to not have concerns when trying to conduct more research with the data that they have, right? To open up the ability to query this information to more stakeholders, as opposed to keeping things all really locked down within an IT team or a specially credentialed team to work in. If you have this de-identification capability, you can have research assistants, medical fellows, physicians directly access that data. You can build tools that help you scale your ability to understand, what you actually have. And so it's important to know that, when you're managing clinical data at the enterprise level, you're just better able to manage the data and privacy and security of all of your different stakeholders, whether this is people making business decisions, whether it's with quality improvements, or whether it's for research. So there's a lot of argument, I think, around the fact that these disparate data systems that hospitals typically have today create a lot more vulnerability for hospitals' data management efforts overall.
Yeah, Victor, I mean, I would just sum this up by saying it's easy to, as whether as a health system or as a vendor, to circulate these giant questionnaires as sort of like a check the box formality. Oh, do they have multi-factor authentication? I mean, most of the stuff we're talking about on the security side is table stakes. You wouldn't be playing in the healthcare space if you didn't invest the time and resources. But I think what really should be recognized is vendors that set themselves apart are combining not only the table stakes, but then they're going that extra mile and they're saying, well, how is this going to impact patient care? How is this going to help improve the bottom line? It's not just an exercise in going through a 200 questionnaire item. It's really saying, how am I leveraging the valuable clinical data asset that I'm sitting on to improve the health system's operating cadence, but ultimately, obviously, the patients that are there as sort of the people at the forefront of this.
Thanks, everybody. I think that's a good summary of the clinical data landscape today, talking quite a bit about privacy, security, data, research. I think moving more toward what we're looking at for the future of clinical data, certainly talking about some of the buzz phrases that I've heard, everybody's heard, AI, all of that. I'm going to turn it over to Chris to start us off.
Thanks, Kathy. Yeah, we're definitely excited about the future of healthcare data, particularly the data science, and as Kathy mentioned, the AI. It is sometimes hard to know, like, what is a buzzword, what is real, and also a lot of the news ranges from, this is going to change everything in positive ways, and then there's sometimes some doom and gloom, like this is going to take everyone's job, AI is going to eliminate everything we need to do. And we definitely think, there are some things to be concerned about, some things we want to do carefully, but also we want to take a realistic approach to AI. It's not all doom and gloom, and it's not all, revolutionary, change everything either. There's a lot of cool things it can do, and I think we can have some fun with it. There's a lot of buzzwords and a lot of headlines about it. And so we wanted to talk for a few minutes just about where we see it being used in healthcare today. And data science, predictive analytics are, a huge opportunity for healthcare and for every industry is starting to get more into this and using it more in their workflows. But all data science and AI is based around predictions. It's taking what has happened before and making a prediction about a new data set based off what has happened before on what's going to happen this time. It's all based around predictions. And we can tend to talk about AI and data science like it's kind of magical or all-knowing, but really it requires a huge amount of data to be able to get benefit out of so that it can make predictions about the data that it will encounter in the future. And that data has to be really, really clean and consistent. And that's where we see a lot of value coming in. You know, I think everyone on this call is probably aware that healthcare data can be sometimes a little rough around the edges or need a little bit of cleaning or tightening up to have the correct diagnosis codes, the correct procedures built. All of these are issues that healthcare's been dealing with for a long time, but to get the most out of data science, we've really got to take that data and abstract it or put best practices around our data entry to be able to feed those data models the cleanest data for them to make their future predictions. And whether we're talking about AI as like, you know, the chat bots that we see in ChatGPT or healthcare specific data models, some of the things, you know, that are exciting about is like the ability to feed an image into AI, like an image of a mole or a lump, and have it determine, this is likely skin cancer or not, just based off images that it has been fed before with outcomes. This mole is cancerous and this mole is not. Helps train those models using that clean data to be able to make the predictions. ChatGPT actually does the exact same thing. It is merely predicting the next word that's going to be in a sentence based off, millions and millions and billions of sentences that it has been fed before. When you ask ChatGPT a question, just like all other AI models, it is simply making a prediction on what word is most likely to come next in the sentence based off the data that has been fed previously. And an important thing for AI to remember, or for healthcare to remember when working with AI, is that more data points are always going to be better and help generate better predictions for us. For example, if you are able to say, data point A equals B 80% of the time, your AI prediction model is only going to be right 80% of the time. So if you're able to feed in more data, if A is true and B is true and C is true, then D is true 99% of the time. That's far better predictions that you'd be able to get out of healthcare predictions as well, whether that's helping to write healthcare notes or helping to predict diagnoses based off of images. Victor, what do you think about the dataset creations for AI?
Yeah, so maybe a bit of context. Chris touched on it. He described the healthcare data as rough around the edges, which I would say is a pretty generous characterization. The reality is that healthcare data, especially in its unstructured form, is really, really brutal to work with. It's not like the types of large data sets being spun out by other industries. So Q-Centrix historically has been in the business of supporting data set creation for a range of use cases. Some of this is quality reporting, some of it's for research. More recently, we've actually started developing data sets that our partners, both hospitals and people working within their innovation functions, as well as other data partners need in order to train AI, NLP, and other types of algorithms. So that said, maybe splashing a little bit of cold water on the hype around AI, I think it's really, really important to note that healthcare is still really in the early innings of the adoption of this type of technology. Right? Healthcare data scientists really aren't predicting what customer segment is most likely to buy a pair of shoes online, but they're really talking about trying to make substantive clinical calls about how patient disease will progress, how it should be treated. This isn't to say that other industries' usage of predictive models isn't important, but it is to say that the bar is pretty high when it comes to impacting point of care decisions or the research that might influence how medicine is ultimately practiced. So, in terms of all the dialogue around AI, my view is that we're oftentimes skipping a step by focusing around, the prediction layer when we've yet to fully solve the challenges associated with data integrity and data quality and just trust of the underlying data. I think it's pretty well known. AI is really only as good as what you feed it. So as a result, I think Q-Centrix is very much part of this dialogue, but it's almost like, you know, the step before the algorithms. We're certainly invested on this front. At the same time, what we're really focused on is this process of being able to build consistent, repeatable, quality gold standard training sets to try to avoid some of this garbage in, garbage out challenge that's starting to happen with a lot of these AI models. And we hear it from our customers too. So while the industry is still struggling to build some of these training sets, I think, you know, we have to solve that problem first before we can really start having a lot of high confidence in the models that are being made available.
Yeah, Victor, it's super exciting to see all the fun toys that you can, you know, the novel things that you can use AI for. It's, you know, you can't really go through any of the news sites sometimes without seeing these sort of comical and chaotic AI searches gone bad. And like you said, in all seriousness, the application in healthcare is critical. The outcomes are literally life altering at times. And so it would behoove us all to say, well, AI can solve these things overnight. And the reality is it can't. You know, operators, you know, the directors, managers, et cetera, they're not going to be able to materially change, you know, direct patient care, but they could probably improve around the edges here. And I think just to, if you're the cold water, then I'm going to really freeze people by saying, hey, all right, you still got to be cognizant of HIPAA and privacy laws, because you know, if you look at some of the how the data is shared as they are entered into things like ChatGPT and Bard, they have a HIPAA compliance angle to them, and we've, you know, been examined these, and you know, you have to be sure that whoever you're playing with in the space, whether it's a vendor or whether it's your own internal team, that they're leveraging these tools in a compliant fashion. And the reality is a lot of technology developments in healthcare and a lot of other industries, frankly, the law can be slow to react. And so the ability for the regulators to change in real time is nearly impossible. I mean, you can see how the other ancillary industries like cryptocurrency took a very long time and frankly a lot of harm before people realized that there needed to be a framework of regulation around it. And I think we'll start to see things of similar nature take place here on the impact of AI in the healthcare space. You know, one of the things that I know all of you are familiar with, and perhaps some of the folks listening are familiar with, is the American Medical Association is they're actively working on policy statements around the role that AI can play in the hospital and healthcare environment. And I think this is really important. We wanna have fun and develop things and move the ball materially forward in how we deliver patient care. But I think the one industry where we sometimes do have to, you know, at least be cognizant of the implications is healthcare and how we leverage technology. You know, I like to think the leading role in healthcare always goes to people. You know, you don't have healthcare without people. You can drive cars, you know, cars can move around, transportation can exist without people. But ultimately technology is always going to be a supporting role. It's not the lead role. The reality is we have to remember that healthcare is about humans. And so when you bring it back to that and you see how do things like artificial intelligence, augmented reality and generative AI, how these things can improve, ultimately it comes down to the humans and the patients. And I think as long as we ground it there, which is what a lot of these laws help us do in compliance, I think that's the key.
Thanks, Mitch. I think whether we're talking about, you know, the future of AI or looking at just healthcare analytics, one of the areas that I think could always be improved too is centralizing our approach to clinical data across facilities and across departments within a healthcare system, or even within hospitals across a larger system that has acquired some through mergers and acquisitions, for example. I think there can tend to be a tendency for data to be siloed across individual systems. So, you know, a patient's data is going to be some of it's going to be available within the laboratory system, and some of it's going to be available within the pharmacy systems, and a lot of it is within the EMR systems. And some of these systems talk well with each other, and some of them much less so. And it's hard to get, a full view of what's happening to the patients and the populations that we serve when data is siloed across these different groups. And one of the ways that I think we can really see some performance improvement is by putting in efforts through data warehousing and through building out structures to be able to combine the data from these different areas of the hospital. It's how we're going to continue to get better insights into the patient care, better consistency with our registry submissions, and better paths for discovery for improvement and how hospitals are going to handle patient care and best practices. Leveraging market analytics for healthcare can help evaluate operational efficiencies, site of care shifts, and just improve our performance on our care of patients across the board. And I think one important thing too is a growing area is healthcare research, that which feeds into our analytics, our healthcare AI, and opening up paths for what can be done better in the future through research. Enterprise data really opens the door in that area.
Yeah, I think as we touch on this whole enterprise strategy, right, centralizing data in one place, obviously lots of different things that hospitals can start doing with it. At Q-Centrix, one of our big views is that hospitals can be doing a lot more research. We hear from a lot of our partners that research is really viewed as something that's almost inherently at odds with hospital budget constraints and cost considerations. A lot of this comes from the fact that a lot of hospitals have been, not successful with their efforts in the past. They've agreed to join a clinical trial, but they hired a person, they went through a study startup process, but weren't able to recruit any patients for a range of their trials over the course of multiple years. And so ultimately, it creates this perception that research departments really struggle with their operations. And that the finances of running a research department just will never sort of hit budget neutral and will always, come secondary to other decisions. I think one of the realities here is that being more data-driven in research can really open the doors to taking on research that's well-funded and reduce the risk associated with some of these pitfalls of interventional trials, right? Hospitals sometimes aren't taking on the right trials to match their population in the first place. And so they've basically made commitments for a number of patients that they'll get into a trial that was unachievable from the start, as one kind of simple example. Also, then they might have trials that are perfectly suited for their population, but they don't have the data and the systems in place to actually find these patients and talk to them and recruit them into these trials, as they come through the hospital. And so by being more data-driven here, hospitals are also able to expand beyond just those interventional investigational trials. There is a lot of demand for registry-based studies, for chart review and observational retrospective data sets, right? And that demand, I think, actually translates to a much simpler, more stable approach to research. Instead of taking on the risk that you'll find 10 patients of a certain variety over the course of 2 years, you can agree or an opt-in or out of studies based off of things that are fully knowable. Right? If you're looking for a certain type of patient that's presented over the last 3 years, the hospital has the ability to answer those questions and be confident to say, yep, we have 57 patients that we can include into a study of this specific nature. But that comes with unlocking access to this data, right? Actually being able to answer these questions quickly as opposed to right now. Oftentimes we hear that research departments go about this in a pretty qualitative way. They try to remember how many patients they might have seen in the last year that sort of fit increasingly these really, really narrow populations. And so, all of this is also just to say that being more data-driven can really help make research something that is a revenue driver, right? A sustainable component of the hospital's operations, because ultimately it really matches well with the goals of these hospitals to contribute to the greater good of the patient population. This data can help improve care, it can address health equity in clinical trials, and allow the experience of these patients to be studied in the community.
Maybe if I could just a few concluding thoughts on enterprise. It's something that we've been looking at for a long time. This is not something that's for the most part new. And I think when we look at health systems that have done this and done this well, I think there's a lot of leadership opportunities. And so that's where I'll actually conclude my thoughts on this, which is ultimately getting to an enterprise approach is a leadership opportunity and challenge, right? And we see that playing out across many health systems in many different ways. I think one of the panelists, one of my colleagues, brought up change management. That's an important component of this, right? And working through change management, working through these initiatives in a deliberate, thoughtful manner to ask the question, hey, are we getting the full value of this clinical data? Are we sitting here and being deliberate in our strategy for how to advance A, B, and C? These are all very important questions, and health systems that are deliberate in answering those questions have a meaningful inflection point towards capturing the full value of their clinical data. So what I would encourage those of you panelists, those of you participants, excuse me, that are on the phone and see this day in and day out, right? Try to get yourself out of that day in and day out, right? And say, hey, we are spending a lot of time and money as a health system on securing this data. Are we getting the most value from it? Are our patients getting the most value from it? And if you can't answer those questions to the affirmative, right? Be deliberate in those next set of questions that come. And then the other really important piece of this, we touched on this, I think, to a certain degree within the AI conversation that we had. Personally, health systems that take true north as the highest quality data, so not quality data itself, but the data itself is of the highest quality, have a different perspective on the utility of that data. And so again, if you want to get to a place where you're getting that full value of the clinical data, I would argue focus on the data itself. Make sure it's the highest quality. Make sure it's the most timeliest data that you can get. Right? We work with, I don't know how many number now, a couple hundred hospitals with regards to oncology and making sure that they're up to their accreditation. And every single one, I can, to the T, every single one have substantial oncology backlogs. I get it. There's shortages of CTRs, there's operational challenges, the data is hard to get. We understand all the complexities in getting that data, but it's still that mindset of, hey, are we getting the most timely data? And can we push more and more? So I think if you keep that true north, it will unlock a number of these other dimensions around clinical data that we've all touched on.
All right, thanks, Raghu. Nice closing remarks. I'm going to ask the team to just do a quick speed round of predictions of what you foresee coming soon. And I'm going to go ahead and start on my screen with counterclockwise, starting with Mitch. Mitch, what are your predictions?
Yeah, thanks, Kathy. I mean, I think Raghu opened the conversation with the democratization of data. And I think that effort can start with individual patients sort of demanding that their data is used for some broader good. So how that will actually transpire remains to be seen. But I think as individual patients in the broader healthcare market, I know that I want my data and I'm comfortable with it. And I know others may not be, but I'm comfortable with my data going to help solve some rare diseases or going to solve, find a cure for cancer, whether or not that's because I myself have it, or maybe there's something in my in the data that are collected in the course of providing care to me that it will ultimately lead to a healthier human race. And I know that sounds very sort of aspirational, but I'm in all for contributing. But at the same time, as Victor was saying, I think it's really incumbent on hospitals and innovative companies to ensure that the effort can happen. It has to be deliberate. It's not going to happen with us sitting around hypothesizing. There has to be research partnerships or leveraging compliant AI technology. However you do it, to me, all bets are on the table. So my prediction is, consumers will start to demand that their their data are used to help the broader sort of human race, which I know again sounds very big picture, but I think that it can start with that movement as well as vendor folks in the space that are going to encourage that, hospitals, healthcare systems, folks like Q-Centrix. So,
all right, Chris, speed round. What are your predictions?
Thanks, Kathy. I think AI and predictive analytics, which we've talked about quite a bit, are just going to continue to be a bigger and bigger part of the healthcare ecosystem. I think it's going to be included in more of our workflows. We'll be able to use natural language processing to help parse physician notes. We'll be able to use AI to help improve diagnosis accuracy and be able to help generate instructions for patients a lot quicker than what we're able to do now. Like I mentioned earlier, I think healthcare organizations are going to start seeing more value in investing earlier in data quality, and that can be through abstraction or curation, or just improve data quality or data collection methodologies to improve the quality that's in the system so that they can get the maximum benefit out of the AI and really continue to transform what they're able to do with patient care.
All right, thanks, Chris. Victor.
So there's a lot of buzz around research data, real world data. And so I think a lot of this buzz has been centered on these standalone businesses that try to acquire clinical data in a range of different ways and then leverage that with life sciences. So my prediction is actually, I think the most sustainable and valuable model of clinical data aggregation involves the hospitals directly. And predict that over time, hospitals are going to have more agency over how their data is being used, and be able to sort of share in all of that upside.
All right, Raghu.
Wow, I get to conclude again. This is fun to have the leverage. Look, there's been a lot said. I think everyone's predictions I'd agree with. Mine are relatively straightforward. I think early innings for sure of clinical data. I think the value is going to come from these combinations of data that we don't even know what they are. We don't know what the use cases are. But as we get better data, as we get cleaner data, as we get higher quality data, and we're able to couple them, I think we'll start to see some insights that really pop. So for example, what happens if you were to pair abstracted clinical data with materials management systems and with an OR scheduling system? Add in claims, add in this, that, and the other. I don't know what you'll get, but I'm really excited for that. The high impact insights that can be leveraged, certainly to better American healthcare. And I think if I were to say something, people always focus on the shiny penny, right? That's just human nature. But I think there's a lot of tangible benefit that we can capture here in the very near future by just being better about realizing from the clinical data that we already capture. And I think we're going to start to see this movement where our conversations with health systems are indicating that movement towards an enterprise approach. And I think that will really unlock the next phase of great American healthcare performance.
All right, thanks to all of you for your predictions. We're going to go ahead and get started with the Q&A portion. And we've been collecting questions throughout the program. So I'll stay with you, Raghu, on this first question. You mentioned an enterprise assessment earlier. Can you explain how it works, what it does, who it's for, et cetera?
Yeah, I should probably done that when I mentioned it. So it's a relatively recent offering that Q-Centrix does. It's fairly lightweight, but we look to try to help a hospital assess where they are with their clinical data. So some of the basic questions: how much are we spending on clinical data? Where are we spending the dollars? Technology versus people. What service lines are we in? What registries are we in? Some fairly tactical cataloging answers that allows us then to answer that critical question of what's the value that we're getting, right? And some of the recommendations that we'll work with hospitals through interviews with administrators, with interviews with key physician leaders, is to say, hey, maybe this registry is not right for you. Maybe the investment in this registry is not right for you. And this registry is really important, but it's not staffed correctly, or you're not driving value from it because of A, B, and C. You're not focusing on top of license activities. And so the cataloging, the initial cataloging of all that data, which is manual and obviously the team takes it on, our team takes it on, but it opens up the really important question around value, right? We're spending a lot of money What is the value that we're getting? And then it's a dialogue that we help the senior leadership, the executive leadership at health systems, at health systems. We've done around a dozen health systems representing several hundred facilities now. And just a plug, look for later on this year, we will be publishing the initial findings from that first cohort, if you are, first two cohorts really, of where we've done it. It's a rich data set, and it for us at least, it has opened our eyes in terms of some of those key questions.
Great, thanks, Raghu. This next question is for you, Chris. Joint Commission and CMS have stated they want to move to FHIR reporting, but I'm concerned about reviewing the data for our hospitals before it's reported.
Oh, thanks. That's a great question. I think there's maybe FHIR can be used for instantaneous transfer, like as information happens, a FHIR message can be sent instantly, or it can be sent later after the data has been curated and abstracted and corrected. I have seen for like CMS registries where people relied too heavily on what was in the EMR without going through and reviewing it first. Your question mentioned wanting to be able to review the data ahead of time. In those cases where data had been submitted to CMS before it had been reviewed, the registry submissions actually had failed, and the hospital ended up owing some money to CMS rather than getting expected reimbursements because it hadn't been, the data was not correct. It hadn't been reviewed ahead of time. So I think regardless of the method that information is shared to CMS or to the Joint Commission or other registries, the expectation that it needs to be correct has not changed, that we'll continue to see a need for abstraction and review. And once that has happened, then it can be submitted because we want to get information to these organizations as accurately as possible so that the benefits of that can be shared by both the organization and by the hospital.
Thanks, Chris. The next question, and I think based on time, this may be our last question. What are some ways that hospitals and health systems can leverage clinical data to improve population health outcomes and address social determinants of health? And I'm going to ask this of Victor.
Yeah, it's a great question. Health equity is certainly top of mind right now for a lot of hospitals and the research community overall. I think for the average hospital, it really starts by just being able to measure things better, right? And a lot of this just dovetails exactly with everything we're talking about on the enterprise strategy piece. By having that data, you're actually able to both measure, outcomes of various types of patients, but then also even being able to know more about your patient population. Today, when we talk about health equity in clinical trials, sponsors are looking for those sites that actually are able to quantify, okay, within a specific disease population that we care for, what's the socio-demographic breakdown? What are the breakdowns by race and ethnicity and age? Being able to quickly quantify that helps a lot. And it sounds quite basic, right? But a lot of hospitals are not yet at that point. And by being able to measure this and maybe even conducting your own research in terms of how health outcomes differ across these sort of demographic and socioeconomic lines can help you understand how are we actually performing here. And then I think you can start talking about, well, what are some of the things that we can be doing to address that? But again, it all just starts with measuring and having programs in place that can routinely measure.
Thanks, Victor, and thanks to all of our participants on the phone, on your computers, and to our panelists. We're going to go ahead and close this webinar. Thank you for joining. As we mentioned in the beginning, we will be sending out a recording of this along with a few assets. I really encourage you to take advantage of the survey at the end of this to share with us any ideas you have for future topics. And if you have questions around the topics that we've addressed today, please don't feel like you can only send those to us via the webinar. Feel free to send those in anytime. We're pleased to be part of the conversation. Any of our panelists would be happy to have further conversations with you. So thank you for joining and have a great day.